During meetings with Daniel Gagliardo, participants are presented with stimuli and concepts drawn from their inner lives. The subjects discussed are determined by the questions posed by the attendees, thereby facilitating a valuable dynamic of communication and instruction. The acceleration of the apex of the planetary transition provides participants with tools of synthesis in these talks, intended for individuals or groups whose commitment to transformation confirms to their adherence to the cosmic order that will soon be restored on the planet. The consciousness and the cosmos, a path to one's own inner cosmos. Podcast offered by Uxim Planetary Service Center. Daniel, Jesus was like a beacon when he said, "No one comes to the Father except through me." Daniel Gagliardo answers, he was offering a direct sign because Jesus continually said, "It is not I, but my Father through me." Therefore, when Jesus said everything, he said, and we are attentive, we will see that Jesus points to a single axis, to a single vertical axis of consciousness. The kingdom is within you. He continually pointed to a single point. He said it in a different ways so that everyone who was receptive could respond. In fact, almost no one responded at that time. And even today we could say that there is not much response either. What is happening in the world shows us that there has been little response, but ultimately Jesus was a beacon, of course, as are all major instructors, even minor ones. They are beacons because without those instructors, we cannot move forward. Humanity continually confirms that the truth is material. Without instructors who represent channels of energy and revelation, the only thing humanity would have within its reach is to confirm that everything is material. An instructor stimulates the consciousness of those who are receptive, helping them, assisting them realize that matter is simply the external pole of life. It is not life itself. It is the external side of life. So Jesus was a practical example of spirituality. He was a beacon, as you say, continually illuminating matter while pointing out the source of that light was within. And so were Buddha, Krishna, Apollonius of Tyana, and all the others. But each of them is in an order of reception, of receptivity to inner life, and the work of enlightenment becomes more and more concentrated. It is not automatic, because not all bodies have the same degree of maturity. There are people who, in fact, all of us, returned to this light, and as each one saw it, each one of us in the three bodies of the personality has different degrees of maturity and fluctuation, and therefore different degrees of stability. Therefore, a being may already have a certain condition of alignment installed in one of the bodies, and that body, in this case, let's say the mental body, may be sufficiently aligned with inner life, yet there may still be some emotional fluctuations that the being has to work on as it is able to sustain an alignment of the mind with inner life more and more deeply. Then it is the mind that will have to take charge of advancing towards the eternal present, being receptive to internal energies. When the being is not living in the internal present, it is very much at the mercy of free will reactions in response to the influences of material forces. That is to say, their free will operates as a reactor to the forces of matter, meaning that they do not realize that the influence of the material forces is what is regulating their free will. The compulsive or continuous use of free will is the furthest thing from the eternal present. When the mental body manages to align itself, it gradually offers the influence of that eternal present, which begins and is permanently sustained in the soul as a degree of energy radiation to the personality and the ego. When the ego can sustain the mind by offering it that eternal present, which is an inequality that must begin to be reflected in the personality, alignment gradually takes place. It is not automatic, it does not happen suddenly, and not all bodies respond to the stimuli in the same way. But the important thing is that it has already begun, that the mind has already begun to have that experience. The ego and mind, having that experience, gradually radiate, releasing energy so that the rest of the personality can integrate something that is already a sufficiently stable reality on the mental and ego levels. Daniel, when does the being have to use the will, the free will? The being, says Daniel Gagliardo, has to use the will in its inner search and not use the will to strengthen its relationship with the forces of matter. Then the inner vocation, which has to be sufficiently awakened, allows the ego and the personality to gradually use the volitional in accordance with the inner attunement, that approach to inner life. Without volitional energy orientated in the same circulatory sense as the inner calling, it is not possible. A being may have an inner calling and still have an awakened will to some extent, which causes them to suffer greatly from this contradiction. They have an already awakened and conscious need to seek the inner life, but they are continually responding to the forces of matter, to the influences of the forces of the psychic layer. So, there is a stage where they have to overcome this and confirm whether their will, in a firm, sufficiently continuous and fluid way, will serve them in approaching what that inner calling is pointing out to them as their destiny. Because the inner calling is the calling to know and to immerse ourselves in the influence of our inner life. Therefore, the will has to be educated for that. And that is where we sometimes point to the cosmosophical meaning of the word discipline, which is the capacity of the being to renounce its own tendencies. Because the ego and the personality, if they are not attentive, have the tendency to respond to the psychic forces, to the forces of matter. That is where discipline, the capacity to renounce those tendencies and temporarily lead us exclusively to experiences of free will and karmic experiences, must begin to be reversed. We must begin to reverse that situation. Daniel, I mechanically enter into fluctuations or changes of trails and tests. Daniel Gagliardo says, fluctuations will always exist. The issue is that the being should not become stuck in the fluctuation, because fluctuating is a common process in matter when matter is governed by the law of karma. The issue is not fluctuating. The issue is immediately working in opposite direction of that dip in consciousness that the fluctuation will allow you to experience. There are people who, when they fluctuate, always confirm the lower counterpart of the fluctuation, and there comes a point where, when the fluctuation itself stagnates between the higher negative but least negative and the lowest, most negative, then there comes a point when the fluctuation is only the negative field. It is logical to fluctuate in a karmic field, but the fluctuation learned to cope with the right way is that we move from the highest positive position. We fall a little, we work in opposite direction to the slump, that mistake or that deviation, and we go back to looking for the higher counterpart that is the closest to the inner life, that it can sustain at this stage. So, there are two ways to experience fluctuation. Even when a being is not redeemable and cannot overcome certain karmic levels and remains very unstable, confirming their complicity with matter, when they are taken to certain karmic universes, they will also receive from the hierarchy the transmutation and assumption of karmic aspects that they could in no way cope with or have to face in that other karmic universes to which they are directed. That is to say, the hierarchy is continually taking charge of karmic debts that would prevent us from going either up or down. There are beings who, due to their refractory condition at the evolutionary level, would have nowhere to go if there were no hierarchical compensation. Not even in the lowest of universes could they do the work of restoration. So the hierarchy is continually transmuting karmic depths in order to accommodate them on the different levels, both downward and upward. The accumulated karmic burden is so great that without this hierarchical intervention we could go neither downward nor upward. Can we work on our defects and limitations? Well, Daniel Gagliardo says, that will depend on each individual and on us. So, certainly, being able to see our defects, our limitation, as you said, is related to faith, because faith is precisely a field of energy that projects our inner life onto us. And in order to see something true in ourselves, only our inner life can show it to us, because the ego and the personality are not in a genuine position to see what they are. They either believe they are more than they are, or, on the contrary, they have a perception of inferiority and believe they are less than they are. But in order to truly perceive our limitations, our characteristics, what we really need to attend to in terms of self-purification, renunciation, potential detachment, that can only be lived in faith. A being who does not have faith cannot be guided by their inner life to perceive who they are and what they have to do with their life. An ego and personality that do not live in faith, in reality, are living under free will that will offer them different faces and an immense number of variables that are all illusions. Fate itself is a guarantee we may or may not accept and activate that guarantee. It is a guarantee because it is inner life itself. Inner life guarantees that we will be immersed in a vibrational, magnetic, and energetic context as we see it, and energy context as we seek it. Fate is the highest response that inner life can offer an individual. So what I'm doing is accepting in fate everything that is part of my life. I live in fate, accepting what life places before me. Fate will allow me to find my own inner consciousness in the events that life places before me. The mechanisms of laws to place something before my consciousness actually work so that I discover in them their own cosmic and inner will. So, if my relationship with my inner life, my cosmic life, the cosmos within me, is already genuine, I will leave all of that in fate, discovering that in every situation that life places before me, there is my own inner consciousness, the giver of that energy of fate for my existence, for what I am. You have heard a collection of recordings of Daniel Gagliardo's teachings, the founder and instructor of Cosmosophy line Oxim, recorded during Cosmosophy gatherings held across Europe and in the serene landscape of Oxim, Argentina.